Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. I told him to say interim, but he said that wasn't what the president said. So I'm saying it is my pleasure to introduce to you a theologian, ethicist colleague, the Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, who received his Master's of Divinity, his MA, and his PhD in Religion and Society from Claremont School of Theology in Claremont, California. He is currently the Assistant Professor of Theology at the University of San Diego, he's United Methodist, but the University of San Diego is a Catholic-based university. His teaching and research interests are in Black and Womanist theological ethics, environmental ethics, religion and food, and religion and animals. His publications include The Spirit of Soul Food from the University of Illinois Press, an article entitled Blood in the Soil, the Racial, Racist, and Religious Dimensions of Environmentalism in the book, The Bloomsbury Handbook on Religion and Nature, and an essay in The Future of Meat Without Animals. He explores the intersectional oppressions experienced by people of color, the environment, and animals. In addition to his work in the academy, he is also an assistant pastor at Pacific Beach UNC. He is a Faith in Food Fellow at Farm Forward, a nonprofit that aims to reduce farm animal suffering and promote sustainable agriculture. He's funny too, so enjoy Christopher as he shares with us today.
Thank you, Dean Bridgman, and I will do my best to live up to the humor aspect that I was built. Let me see if we can get there we go, perfect. I want to thank the Compass Program for the invitation, and Methodist in Ohio and Ohio State University. I had hoped when I emailed Eric about coming out here that it was mid-April, so I anticipated that it would be maybe slightly less snow, slightly less. But nonetheless, I've been treated well since I've been here, despite the weather, and so far so good, I guess I should say. So the title of my talk today is Food Pyramid Scheme. I'm going to talk for probably about 35 minutes, and then we'll transition to some conversations. And I'm hopeful that throughout this talk, it's kind of two dimensions I'm really going to discuss. First is the problematic nature of the construction of our food system and kind of how that comes across in the racialized dimension. But secondly, what role has theology played, Christian theology especially, in being complicit in allowing this structural inequalities to take place, and what might Christian theology be able to contribute to a kind of a reclamation or a repair of the systems as such. My grandfather grew up as a migrant farmer in Mississippi, and some of his earliest memories are of walking behind him in plowing fields. He plowed, picked fruit, harvested cotton and tobacco, basically whatever they would allow him to do. He once told me how excited he was to get a raise from 25 cents to 40 cents an hour when he was 8 years old, because it signified he was capable of working like an adult, even though he was still a child. My mother got a work ethic from her parents, and during particular hard times in her life, she worked 2 or 3 part-time jobs just so we could afford to be poor. She stretched every dollar she could in order to feed her 3 children, and would often buy food stamps from junkies so that we would have enough food to eat. But unfortunately, that wasn't always the case. We didn't always have enough food, and there were times I would go to bed hungry or go to school hungry. I share these stories to frame our discussion about the American food system. Workers such as my grandfather, consumers such as my mother, and countless people who lacked access to food as I did when I was a child, are victims in a food system that privileges access to and an oppressive use of power, a system that privileges race, and a system that privileges class. So, when I began to think and write about food justice and an appropriate Christian response, I had to take these and other stories to heart and ask myself, what would food justice look like to these people? Ultimately, my research and my personal experience reveals that racism and what I call a logical oppression have been controlling factors in the development of U.S. foodways. Despite the fact that the negative aspects of U.S. domestic food policy disproportionately affect people of color in general, and black people specifically, many activists within movements that I would just define as a complete food movement, local food movements, slow eating movements, essentially like any kind of hipster food movement. Any of them, they don't have, they speak often, and I'm literally struggling, I struggle to find one, that had racial justice and anti-racism work as a core component of their food justice strategy, right? They mention food justice without really mentioning, they mention racial dimensions, don't mention racial justice as a component of their food justice strategy. These groups, whose leaders tend to be white, argue that food disparity among communities of color is merely a product of lack of access or lack of education or a combination of both. Moreover, many churches who have some form of food justice ministry have followed suit and do not see how the pursuit of food justice is tied to anti-racism. So the question that confronts us and animates today's discussion is why? Why aren't the aforementioned food justice communities able to see and prioritize addressing the structural racism that's in our food system? The structural racism that's evident on this graph you see in front of you. Why are church communities and Christian food justice advocates making the same mistakes? In today's talk, I suggest that there are at least two reasons that account for these shortcomings. First, white Americans, even the liberals, tend to have an insufficient understanding of racism and race and interpret their worldview through what Joe Fegan calls the white racial frame. Second, racism in the white racial frame has enabled Christians and Western Christian theologians of all races to define what it means to be human through a broken theological anthropology. Seeing people of color through this broken theological anthropology allows them to see them as less than human, which fosters complacent behavior when it comes to addressing these structural inequalities. Americans tend to have what can be referred to as a common sense understanding of what race and racism are. Meaning that most of us believe that race is merely someone's skin tone, and that racism is prejudice towards someone because of said skin tone. And yet, the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement and the rhetoric surrounding the 2016 election of Donald Trump as President of the United States reveals that there is much that Americans disagree on when it comes to race. So before I can show you how in its current configuration our domestic food system is what I would call a racist racial project, we must first understand what I mean by race and racism. In its simplest terms, race is a way of identifying and classifying human beings. As social beings, we categorize the world to make sense of it. Human classifications can help us discern our friends from our enemies, pitch ourselves within accepted social hierarchies, and guide us in our interactions with individuals and groups we encounter. Sociologists Michael Omi and Howard Winott argue that in the United States, race should be understood as a master category, a fundamental concept that has profoundly shaped and continues to shape the history, polity, and economic structure and culture of the United States. In this way, we must accept that the onset of the transatlantic slavery and the encounter with the Native Americans were fundamental to race making and categorizing the people who constitute the modern world. Doing so makes it clear that race has become a template of both difference and inequality, hence its placement as a master category of social organization. The majority of scholars accept that race is a socially constructed category. Beyond the scholarly world, however, the category of race is often seen as either objective or illusory. It is either rooted in biological difference or in ideological construction. I'm critical of both positions and contend that while race is not solely rooted in nature, it is also not merely an illusion. It carries definite social consequences as a social category. In this way, race can be understood as an unstable and decentered web of social meanings that are constantly being transformed through political struggle. Race, as a concept, signifies and symbolizes social conflicts and interests while referring to different types of human bodies. Although a common sense understanding of race invokes biologically based human characteristics, we must remember that the selection of biological features used in classification is always social and historical in process. Despite the imprecise and arbitrary history of racial signification, race is not meaningless. It performs ideological work and has real political consequences. Despite the problematic nature of racial categorization, the visual dimension of race plays a crucial role in defining and understanding racial categories. Because these distinctions have been essentialized, any body that can be visually read as being of European descent is categorized as white within the United States. And all other bodies are persons of color, Black, Latinx, Asian, Asian American, etc. To be racially identified is to be located within a social structure that has historically used race to demarcate cultural boundaries, political rights, and economic opportunities. These demarcations are best understood as racial projects because they link the visual signification of our race to these social structures, right? They link race and social structures. Racial projects create an ideological and practical links between the social structure of society and one's race. Consequently, a racial project could also be understood as an effort to organize and distribute resources, economic, political, or cultural resources, along particular racial lines. Racial projects connect what race means in particular discursive or ideological practices, and elucidates how both the social structure and everyday experiences are lived out and racially organized based on that meaning. So racial projects essentially organize the distribution of goods in our society. When we consider the dramatic role that racialization played in the development of social structure of the first colonies and later the United States, the notion of race as a master category becomes clear. The conquest of America initiated modern racial awareness and, as such, could be considered the first and perhaps the greatest informational project. Given this, it is clear that the process of racialization and the project of racial formation is embedded in the DNA of American socio-political culture. The fact of race does not mean that seeing race itself as a problem and that Americans should accordingly strive to move toward a post-racial or colorblind society. Rather, I contend that the task of any project that attempts to examine the social structures of American society ought to utilize racial analysis to have a clear and accurate understanding of the everyday implications of the structures of our society. In regards to the economic and political oppression within the U.S. of the food system, the tentacles of food injustice reach beyond the production of food and are most visible in communities of color by lack of access to fresh and healthy foods and the subsequent health problems among us that are tied to our lack of access. I define food justice as ensuring the benefits and risks of where, what, and how food is grown and produced, transported and distributed, accessed and eaten are shared fairly. In this way, the reorganization and redistribution of food resources is always what marginalized In this way, the reorganization and redistribution of food resources in ways that marginalize people of color and the poor, who are disproportionately people of color, are best understood as forms of environmental racism because of the impact it has on these communities. Viewed through the racial formation theory, it becomes clear that the domestic and arguably international food systems should be understood as racial projects because within both systems, the organization and distribution of goods can be traced along particular racial lines. Race has become a template of both difference and equality within the food system in ways that have proved to be disadvantageous for many people of color. Indeed, our domestic and global food systems are, in fact, racist racial projects because the distribution of goods can be traced along racial lines, meaning that food is not grown, produced, transported, and distributed, accessed, and eaten fairly. In this way, food should be at the part of our conversations when discussing race and racism and its everyday effects on people of color. Communities of color not only feel environmental racism through the placement of incinerators and landfills and things that we may already be aware of, but also the displacement of accessible vital goods and services such as grocery stores. A study of the nation's largest metropolitan areas by the University of Connecticut Food Marketing Policy Center sheds light on the depth of this social justice issue. On a nationwide basis, the Policy Center found that zip codes with the highest percentages of house grant public assistance had less supermarket space per capita than higher income zip codes. Moreover, a study of food stores in Maryland, Minnesota, Mississippi, and North Carolina found that chain supermarkets were 4 times more likely to be located in predominantly white neighborhoods than in black neighborhoods. What you see here on this map is the distribution of food insecurity along what I would call the black belt of the South, right? So the dark areas in the South, where there's predominantly more people of color, you see a lesser, more food insecure. Mark Winnie, former executive director of the Hartford Food System, argues that the combination of white flight, low-income households, and urban blight caused many grocery stores to abandon the inner city. Before becoming a national spokesperson for food justice, when he began his career with the Hartford Connecticut Food System in 1979. Just 10 years earlier, Hartford had 13 large chain supermarkets within city limits. By the time Winnie arrived in 1979, only 6 6 stores remained open, and then only 2 by 1986. As he began to research the problem, he discovered that supermarkets began to leave the city after the civil uprisings of 1969. In fact, they followed the exodus of middle and upper class whites to the suburbs. This data follows the trend identified by the University of Connecticut's Food Policy Council that grocery stores are filling low-income, predominantly Black and Latinx urban areas. Given that 80% of Americans buy their food in full-size supermarkets, most of which are large chain markets, this flight poses a severe problem regarding food access to urban communities. The lack of large retail food stores in urban, predominantly Black and Latinx communities has contributed to what Winnie describes as the food gap. Winnie defines the food gap in terms of a failure of our market economy to serve the basic human needs of those who are impoverished. From a food justice perspective, the food gap is a major problem facing low-income, inner-city, rural communities in their struggle to eliminate hunger and food insecurity. Again, looking at the map, you see in the South, rural communities, communities that are tend to be poor, tend to be communities of color. To be clear, one can make the case for outright discrimination by the supermarket industry. However, I cannot fit that into my conversation today as well. But I do want to lay that out there, that there is discrimination happening among them. However, to be fair, I want to take on, I guess, the strongest counter-argument that they actually would make. The counter-argument they would make against supermarket discrimination is that because they are for-profit organizations, they have the responsibility to make money for their shareholders. That's what they would say in response to my critique. As such, they primarily base their location decisions on revenue projections and the number of targeted customers they think they can reach within a particular geographic area. Given that supermarkets have thin margins and rely upon volume sales to make money, they argue, based on financial sense, they're going to be reluctant to open a store in an economically disadvantaged neighborhood because they would be less likely to reach volume sales necessary to turn a profit. However, if we consider the impact of environmental racism on these poor communities, making them economically undesirable destinations by placing landfills, waste sites, factories, and highways within them, to think about the consequences of racism on the economic capacities and capabilities of these people by not allowing them to have access to equal employment, it becomes evident that these communities have little chance within the current supermarket model to avoid becoming food deserts. The second negative impact of food injustice among people of color, specifically among African Americans here, that is connected to food access, concerns the health consequences that plague this self-same community, such as heart disease, cancer, stroke, and diabetes. A significant threat to Black life, what I call Black life, is what I define as our ability to have a life, to live a flourishing life and a life worth living. A significant threat to that life comes from our food supply in the form of highly processed foods, the abundance of fast food restaurants in Black communities, and the minimally regulated chemical additives that are found in these foods. Unsurprisingly then, the rates of diet-related disease break down dramatically along racial lines. Indeed, the politics of the food industry have devastating consequences for Black people. This is most evident in the seemingly counterintuitive relationship between obesity and hunger. For instance, according to the Los Angeles County Public Health Department, South Los Angeles has the highest rates of poverty, food insecurity, and obesity in the county. How can a community of overweight people also be experiencing high levels of food insecurity, you may have asked? A primary reason is that the food to which these communities of color have access to is nutritionally deficient. Struggles with obesity and hunger are inevitable when one consumes larger quantities of less nutrient-dense food, or when one can only afford smaller quantities of less nutrient-dense food. Food justice activist Kristen Workman notes that African Americans get sick at younger ages, have severe illnesses, and die sooner than white Americans. According to the American Journal of Public Health, Blacks are 50% more likely than whites to experience health problems due to stress. The Center for Disease Control reports that Black people are 51% more likely to be obese, and that half of the Black children born in the U.S. in the year 2000 are expected to develop type 2 diabetes. Black people are also twice as likely to die from heart disease or stroke than whites. I agree with Workman when she suggests that just as our economy has become starkly stratified with wealth concentrated at the top, it's increasingly clear that we live in a two-tier food system in which the wealthy tend to eat well and are rewarded with better health, while the poor tend to eat low-quality diets, causing their health to suffer. Given that such health disparities can be traced back to food accessibility within Black communities, food justice should be viewed as critical for the survival and flourishing of Black people, specifically with people of color in general. And yet, despite the obvious connection between systematic racism, food justice advocates and organizations are unlikely to identify anti-racism as a key component of their organizational mission. One reason why racism may be overlooked can be traced to the racial makeup of many food justice organizations. Rachel Slocum, a sociologist whose research explores the role of race in U.S. food systems, has described how the unacknowledged presence of white privilege give lie to the food movement's rhetoric of justice, ghetto tensions, and sustainability. To be sure, the stories and ideologies that shape the modern food justice movement have been interpreted and retold through the lens of what sociologist Joe Fegan calls the white racial frame. The white racial frame is a worldview that interprets everything through the lens of white experience. Indeed, it is the dominant worldview of Western society, and it encompasses a broad and persisting set of racial stereotypes, prejudices, ideologies, images, interpretations, and narratives, emotions and reactions to language accents, as well as racialized inclinations to discriminate. The dominant framing of whiteness as such, as positive, and people of color, particularly black people, as negative, has fostered a hegemonic superiority of a particular kind of white social values, political values, economic values, religious values, environmental values, to name a few, what I'm going to be discussing today. The white racial frame is the dominant frame of American culture and continues to be foundational to both religion and society today. In this way, the white racial frame explains how, for some white people, the phrase Black Lives Matter feels like a threat to white life because their experiences are not being centered. Their white experiences aren't being centered to them. For them, it's easier to say all lives matter rather than to discern why there is this value in black life on its own terms. With respect to food justice, the white racial frame explains how mostly white food justice activists can argue for the building of grocery stores in underserved neighborhoods without also arguing for policies that will ensure public transportation to the store, or economic policies that will enable those communities to afford to shop at the newly constructed grocery stores they advocate to get built. When viewed through the lens of whiteness, all disparities between whites and blacks are often underestimated. For example, Fegan notes that in one national survey of 779 whites from all over the United States, found that 61% viewed the average black person as having healthcare access at least equal to that of the average white person. About 50% felt that black Americans had a level of education similar to or better than whites in general. And about 50% felt that black Americans felt that on average whites and blacks are about as well off in their jobs as they both. Each of these views are woefully inaccurate. When the results of several such questions are combined, 70% of whites were found to hold one or more erroneous beliefs about the important white-black differentials and life conditions that I just named. Only 20% of whites evaluated the current societal situation accurately on a question about how much discrimination African Americans face. The majority of whites are willfully ignorant or misinformed when it comes to the understanding the difficult life conditions that African Americans and other Americans face every day. Basically, white people tend to just not know, but they have to experience on a daily basis to live. To be sure, there are some who argue that, given the social construction of race, class analysis alone offers a better interpretive lens for considerations of systematic oppression like we find in our food system. While I agree that class is an essential component to any thoroughgoing analysis, there are two problems with the colorblind approach to this particular kind of social analysis. First, it fails to recognize the power that social construction can develop over the course of over 500 years of diffusion and enforcement as a fundamental principle of social organization and identity formation. The longevity of the race concept and the enormous effects of the American Racial Project, which simultaneously interprets, represents, or explains racial identities and meanings in an effort to organize and distribute resources along particular lines, almost guarantees that race will remain a feature of a social reality. Second, the colorblind approach fails to recognize that, on a level of lived experience, race is a part of everyone's identity. One cannot just choose to be raceless. From such perspective, to be without racial identity is to be in danger of having no identity at all. As a consequence of the American Racial Project, everyone in the U.S. learns both consciously and unconsciously how to interpret his or her existence along the lines of racial classification. While one can argue that it is an absolute travesty that food justice organizations tend to employ a colorblind approach to address structural inequalities in our food system, I find this trend particularly troubling call themselves Christians. Troubling, but again, through my research, unsurprising. If Christians are called to, as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. declared, to follow Jesus' guidelines and heal those who have suffered under the tyranny of injustice, to free people from sociological and ideological biases that inhibit community, and to liberate those who are oppressed, if Christians are called to practice Christianity in this light, then why aren't we more active in the environmental justice movement in general, and the food justice movement in particular? Why are millions of Christians debating the scientific merits of climate change? Why has Western Christian theology developed in such a way that creation care is considered a progressive issue rather than an issue that concerns all Christians? I mean, I think these are fundamental questions, right? I will argue that the relaxed attitudes many Christians, particularly white Christians, have regarding care for the environment and concern for food justice can be traced to Western Christianity's dehumanization of people of color. Indeed, Christian theology's broken theological anthropology enables us to overlook the environmental suffering of people of color because, from the perspective of the theology of the dominant Christian culture, people of color aren't quite human. Eco-feminist theologian Rosemary Radford Luther has argued that the roots of the disconnect we currently see between many Christians and earth care lie in systems of domination and exploitation created by white male elites who deny their interdependency with women, people of color, and nature in order to exploit human labor and divide the community around them. Building on this claim, I want to suggest that within Christianity, the oppression of people of color was justified through theological norms that viewed these bodies as other, and on the anthropological theory that people of color were less rational and therefore less human than whites. Thus, I contend that the theological problem confronting Christians of all races as it relates to environmental justice in general, and food justice in particular, has been the adoption of a racist, sexist, and anthropocentric theological anthropology that justifies the exploitation of nature, humans, and non-human animals. Moreover, by adopting the aforementioned theological anthropology, Christians of color are unknowingly complicit in sanctioning the same oppressive logic that we are trying to overcome. In this sense, I contend that if we, those of you who identify as Christian, but also particularly those who are people of color, are going to take environmental justice and food justice seriously, it's critical that Christians begin to fashion a liberative theological anthropology that creates an alternative vision of what the relationship between God, humanity, and creation entails for us. It's not a coincidence that colonialism and chattel slavery emerged during a period when European Christian men were able to claim that Africans and indigenous American people were evil because they were either non-Christian or too close to nature, and therefore distant from God. Theologian J. Cameron Carter contends that in the 15th and 16th century, European explorers traveled for territorial expansion and acquisition of wealth on the one hand, and for cultural expansion, beginning with Christian missionary and social religious activity on the other. It was during this period of discovery that man, as we understand it now, was invented by Europeans as a way to define what it meant to be human. As such, slavery, colonialism, and the logic of capitalist development that emerged from colonialism can be understood as a problem of a particular Christian theological anthropology. This theological anthropology not only defined black and other non-white bodies as others, but it also extended the othering rationale to non-human animals and nature itself. In other words, the age of discovery produced the image of the European man as the imperial God man, which ultimately led to the production of white supremacy in relationship to non-white others, and human supremacy over the earth and other created beings. Liberation theologian Dwight Hopkins has described this current implicit yet dominant theological anthropology of U.S. Christian culture as demonic individualism. He contends that the theological anthropology of demonic individualism reveals itself in a kind of American cultural trinity. Historical amnesia, which affords American Christians the ability to pretend that history did not occur by avoiding difficult questions that challenge white nostalgia, such as the Native American genocide, or the arguments taking place over the removal of Confederate statues, things of that nature. The second is instantaneous fulfillment of desire has created a lust for instant gratification in one's spiritual life, wherein Christians find comfort in what Dietrich Bonhoeffer would call cheap grace. And third, this weird number one methodology builds upon the notions of American exceptionalism and leads to the dehumanization of our so-called opponents. Currently, our primary opponent, I would say from a political perspective, is Islam. The aforementioned theological anthropology limits the ability of all created beings to flourish by prioritizing the needs of a particular type of individual, historically by Christian men, over the needs of the rest of creation. As it relates to people of color, The dominant U.S. Christian theological anthropology is particularly oppressive because it reinforces theological and anthropological claims about our bodies that have historically undermined our struggle for liberation from oppression. In the same way that women were regarded as inferior to men and unable to reflect the image of God, Africans and indigenous Americans were deemed to be less human than European Christian men. These theological claims made about non-white bodies enabled Euro-American Christians to accept anthropological claims that justify their theological norms. For instance, from the perspective of anthropologists during the 18th and 20th centuries, Africans and African cultures appeared to be less rational than European cultures, and therefore they were clearly less human. The anthropological view that Africans and other non-European people were less human was concretized through the misinterpretation of Darwin's evolutionary theory. Social Darwinism appropriated Darwin's theories of evolution as survival of the fittest for their own use in the theory of winners and losers in social history. Animal activist and author Marjorie Spiegel described social Darwinism as a theory by which the oppression of different races, classes, and species could be rationalized and justified as being only a demonstration of evolution in action, a manifestation of nature bred in tooth and claw. This logic is making a comeback right now. For any of you who aren't familiar, these kind of arguments are being made right now, what we call scientific racism, the things that led to eugenics. I argue that despite the efforts of some 18th and 19th century Christians, remnants of this oppressive theological anthropology are alive and active within American Christianity writ large. Not only did American culture facilitate the theological and anthropological belief that people of color were less human than whites, it also enabled the dominant Christian culture to sidestep the experiences of women and people of color in their construction of the God-human relationship, or theological ecology. This is the U.S. Christian theological anthropology that Christians in America have inherited, a theological anthropology that denies the very humanity of people of color while simultaneously placing some human beings as masters rather than fellow inhabitants of creation. In an open letter written to incarcerated Angela Davis, the essayist and social critic James Baldwin describes with poignant clarity the psychological and emotional impact of U.S. theological anthropology on Black people in America. And I have the quote up here because it's amazing and I didn't want to rob you of reading some more. Here it goes as follows. The American triumph, in which the American tragedy has always been implicit, was to make Black people despise themselves. When I was little, I despised myself. I did not know any better. And this meant, albeit unconsciously, or against my will, or in great pain, that I also despised my father, and my mother, and my brothers, and my sisters. Black people were killing each other every Saturday night on Lenox Avenue when I was growing up, and no one explained to them, or to me, that it was intended that they should, that they were pinned where they were, like animals, in order that they should consider themselves no better than animals. Everything supported this sense of reality, nothing denied it. And so one was ready, when it came time to go to work, to be treated as a slave. So one was ready, when human terrorists came, to bow before a white God and beg Jesus for salvation. Here, Baldwin hints at some Christian norms he hints at how some Christian norms encourage Black people to seek freedom from oppression through eschatological salvation, rather than seeking freedom through the elimination of oppressive structures themselves. Most importantly, Baldwin captures the dehumanization and animalization felt of many people of color in America. Given this, I want to argue that the central message embedded within U.S. Christian theological anthropology, essentially embedded in the way that Christianity teaches people what it means to be human, right, is that in order to be Christian, one must become human. In order to become human, one must become white. In order to become white, one must accept the hierarchy that protects the image of the heterosexual white male as the image of God, the pinnacle of creation. By this, I do not mean to say that American Christians have explicitly been taught, at least in the post-civil rights era, that whiteness is necessarily better than any other race or ethnicity. There aren't clergy, generally speaking, out preaching this kind of message. Rather, American Christians are implicitly taught and socialized to accept the normative structures of Christianity that places humans as the pinnacle of creation. Racial formation ensures that human is understood to be white. Patriarchy ensures that human is understood to be male, and heterosexism ensures that human is understood to be straight. This is the theological and anthropological problem that currently confronts American Christians. People of color have been regarded as less than human, while Euro-American white men have been described as the pinnacle of creation. As such, as people of color and women strive to be considered fully human, we have been striving toward a flawed theological principle that replicates an oppressive hierarchical model that places whiteness and maleness as pinnacles of creation. By adopting this theological ecology, women and Christians of color are unknowingly subscribing to the theological norms that historically marginalized us, our ancestors, and creation. By adopting this theological ecology, white people are subscribing to the same norms and continuing to propagate ideas and beliefs that they may actually not want to believe. Most Christian activists and theologians of color who do anti-racist or human rights work have touched upon the animal question in some way, as Baldwin did. I agree with black feminists Afton Silco's claim that a good analysis of racism or coloniality usually calls attention to the degree to which racialized folks are animalized. That is, those who seek to maintain or create an oppressive dynamic between two groups often describe the marginalized group as falling outside of the realm of human as a way to legitimize behavior that would otherwise be considered unethical at best or evil at worst. Because by an animal, justify treating them a certain kind of way. You see this happening with police, you see this happening with, currently I know President Trump sent out a tweet describing Assad as an animal. I felt for mistake. So this is just the language that we use, right? However, the analysis done by most activists and theologians of color on the relationship between anti-racism and animalization tends to stop at this point, followed by the claim that we people of color are humans too, and that we should be treated as such rather than being treated like animals. And I agree, we should be treated like humans. I want to suggest that this way of thinking, that when we be treated like humans, particularly when human hasn't been problematized, this way of thinking requires an open acceptance of the negative status of the animal, which I argue is a tacit acceptance of the hierarchical racial system of white supremacy in general. To argue to be treated like a human when we haven't problematized with that human is essentially to be treated like a white person. To make that argument is to say I want to be treated like I'm white, which therefore justifies the system of white oppressive hierarchy, right? In this sense, the human-animal divide, as Western white Christianity constructed it during modernity, is the theological and ideological foundation that supports the framework of white dominance. White dominance is supported by this idea of an animal other. This means that our modern delineation of human humanity and animal and animality was constructed along racial lines. As such, the negative notion that human beings have of the animal is the anchor of the system of white colonial logic and the ideology of white dominance. Frantz Fanon makes this clear in He Writes Wretched of the Earth, where he writes, in plain talk, the colonial subject is reduced to the state of an animal, and consequently, when the colonist speaks of the colonized, he uses zoological terms. Allusion is made to the slithery movements of the yellow race, the odors coming from the native quarters. In his endeavors at description and finding the right word, the colonist refers constantly to bestiary. Anti-racist activists have understood these connections for a number of years. What I'm suggesting here is that the strategy of claiming black humanity to subvert this logic will remain ineffective if we do not attend to the racialized dimensions of animality as well, and redefine what it means to be human. The moral and ideological frameworks that support racism and white supremacy, and the frameworks that created our current understanding of the animal, are deeply intertwined and cannot be adequately addressed independently of one another. These ideological frameworks were creations invented by a small percentage of people who took themselves to be the singular point of knowledge and, through centuries of violence, genocide, and control, made their worldview, themselves, and others universal. As long as the Western white theological anthropology that constructed the human and the animal as such remains intact, the ideological support of white supremacy also remains intact. Recall that the idea of what it meant to be human was enmeshed with white male Christian heteronormativity. When someone disparages a group of human beings as animals or animalistic, they do not mean that this group of people fall outside the scientific category of Homo sapiens. Rather, they are stating that these human beings do not look, live, worship, or reason normally, where normal is understood as Eurocentric white norms. In other words, when one does not act white, and for people of color, this is a word we've heard before, acting white. When one does not act white, or when one behaves in ways that challenge white dominance, they are seen as an animal. Depending upon how well some animals can replicate the norms of Western white Christian men dictated as human norms, certain non-white human animals can be treated like humans. Basically, certain people feel like they're treated like a human, even if they are not really human. In this way, the dominant culture's conception of the animal, developed within a Christian culture of white male supremacy, is the conceptual vehicle that morally and ideologically justifies violence against subhuman, people of color, or non-human, animal, others. Consequently, a liberative theological anthropology that enables all Christians to reimagine the God-human relationship in ways that allows all life, human and non-human, to flourish is essential for the liberation from this oppressive theology, which is essential for us to take food justice and environmental justice seriously. The liberative theological anthropology I aim to construct attempts to recast the God-human relationship in ways that can lead to the collective flourishing of all creation by privileging the sacred worth of black embodiment. To be sure, my hope is that this liberatory theological anthropology resonates with all Christians regardless of race. However, having been cast as the marginalized others in white American theological anthropology, if black bodies, particularly the bodies of black women, are free to realize the liberatory selfhood, then freedom for all other bodies would necessarily follow. As such, my liberatory theological anthropology finds its starting point in the theological writings of black women scholars. Lastly, I should also note that the scope of my construction project is not intended to be comprehensive, rather it is to focus on the God-human relationship relative to environmental ethics and more specifically, food justice. At its most basic level, the liberative theological anthropology should aim to describe whom people are called to be. The norm that makes this theological anthropology liberative is the non-negotiable theological principle that all creation has sacred worth and no created being should be marginalized or exploited in the eyes of God. All human beings are created in the image of God, the imago Dei, and should view themselves as humans freed from white Christian patriarchal norms that created or justified the exploitation of another. As such, human beings should strive to create human God, human-human, and human nature relationships that mirror the life and teachings of Jesus Christ, the Mateo Christian, whose earthly ministry was to serve and the marginalized and care for others, or the least of these. Further, we have a divinely appointed vocation to practice stewardship among non-human animals and to care for the earth, which is part of carrying out the mission of God, or the mission of God. These three theological categories are generative insofar as they enable the construction of a counter-narrative that uplifts the dignity, value, and capabilities of bodies, gender as female, and race as black and white. In my closing comments, I will describe how liberative interpretation of these three theological categories build upon and inform each other in ways that would help Christians view earth care as critical and necessary expression of our faith. What does it mean for black people to be described as imaging God? How does being created in the image of God reshape the African American attitudes towards other humans, the earth, and themselves? I contend that by embracing the biblical claim that they are created in the image of God, African American Christians can break free from the U.S. theological and anthropological norm that designated us as less than human or other. In this way, accepting that we were created in the image of God becomes the liberatory response to the othering that African American Christians have experienced. Jesus' embodiment as a human being created in the image of God is significant for black people when we consider his embodiment in light of Jesus' teaching of the greatest commandment, to love God with all one's heart, soul, and strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself. Womanist theologian Karen Baker Fletcher contends that to see Jesus as fully human and fully God is to see Jesus as a manifestation of the Spirit in creation working in harmony with itself. Building upon the Nicene Creed, which states that Jesus is both fully God and fully human, Baker Fletcher contends that Jesus is both fully Spirit and fully God and fully connected to all the elements that comprise the earth. If we follow Baker Fletcher's description of Jesus as both fully human and fully God, then loving Jesus requires that one must both love God and human beings, including ourselves. In this way, the unconditional love of Jesus requires an unconditional love of self. This is critical for black women, black people specifically, black women especially. In this way, moreover, the ability of African American Christians to love themselves also requires the ability to see Christ-likeness in themselves. In this way, for African American Christians, embracing the Christological implications of the imago Dei is crucial because it allows black communities to begin to heal the psychological scars of being othered and the animalization of black bodies. Accepting that, like the earthly Jesus, we were created in the image of God becomes the liberatory response to the othering that we have experienced. As previously stated, the norm that makes theological anthropology liberative is the non-negotiable principle that no created being should be marginalized in the eyes of God. Building upon my earlier claim that we should view Jesus as the image of God perfected, I contend that human beings image God only inasmuch as we model ourselves after the perfected image of Christ. In modeling our lives after the likeness of Jesus, we are working toward actualizing the potential of the imago Dei as it has been revealed to us in its perfected state. As such, a liberative theological ecology requires human beings to accomplish the missio Dei through fostering relationships with other created beings that mirror the life and teachings of Jesus, the imago, whose earthly ministry was to serve the marginalized and care for the least of these. In her volume on Theology and Ecology and Flesh and Freedom, Womanist Catholic theologian Sean Copeland argues that too often Christians forget that Jesus' body was marked by race, gender, culture, and religion. Jesus was a practicing Jew who was once a refugee and as an adult lived in a territory controlled by Roman political, military, and economic forces. For Black Christians, exploring what Copeland calls Jesus' enfleshment is particularly important because it creates an awareness that Jesus was also the subject of empire. Indeed, Jesus lived and carried out a prophetic liberatory message in the tension between resistance to empire and desire for what he called the reign of God. American Christianity often interprets Jesus through the lens of the white racial frame, and thus the radical and prophetic nature of this message is tame. In this way, imitating Christ means reclaiming the radical message of Jesus by embodying a gospel that challenges and denounces oppressive, exploitative relationships. Jesus makes his concern for the elimination of exploitative and oppressive relationships clear in his first major public address, where he states that we are to do to others as you would have them do to you, in Luke 6. The power of this statement is found in its subtlety. If human actions toward those who have been described as others mirror our expectation that they do not treat us as another, then the theological and ecological category of other no longer exists. Indeed, Jesus calls us to recognize that all created beings have sacred worth and are deemed good or very good by God. As such, we all exist in an interdependent relationship. By othering other created beings, in other words, allowing oppressive hierarchical relationships to exist, we violate the norm of a liberative theological anthropology that no being should be oppressed in the eyes of God, because all created beings have sacred worth. As it relates to oppressive human-human relationships fostered by the food system, Jesus' actions of human multitudes, which we find in Matthew 14, reveal how important it is for Christians and by proxy the church to work to ensure that all people have access to or provided food in order to sustain themselves and their families. Moreover, we consider the parable of the great banquet in Luke 4 or Matthew 22, or Luke 14, I'm sorry, Matthew 22. We see the importance of eliminating oppressive hierarchy. The host replaces the absent guest with literally anyone from the street, right? And the banquet table represents the diversity of gender, class, race, and religion. Indeed, Jesus fostered interdependent relationships for practicing solidarity and including people in his ministry who were otherwise outcast. For Jesus, this is how unrestricted neighborly love looks and feels like. All are welcome because all have sacred worth. Understood this way, solidarity can be described as a discernible structure with cognitive, affective, effective, constitutive, and communicative dimensions. Through a practice of solidarity, we not only apprehend and are moved by suffering of the other, we confront and address its oppressive cause and shoulder the burden of the other's suffering. Through a practice of solidarity, Christians are called to apprehend and feel the suffering of food workers and farmers as if it was our own, so that we might address the suffering of food workers and farmers as if it was our own. Since our food system is not only oppressive to human beings, but also to non-human animals, the conceptual framework that justifies the racialized othering of blacks is intertwined with the framework that justifies the animalized othering of non-human animals and human exploitation. I argue that in order to eliminate, rather than just replace, the oppressive hierarchical structure of racism, then Jesus' call to eliminate the theological and anthropological category of the other must extend to both human and non-human animals. In this way, our relationships with non-human animals within our food system should adjust accordingly. As is evident, factory farming maintains an oppressive and other relationship between human beings and non-human animals, and the goal of imitating Christ ought to push Christians to seek to eliminate the systems that justify this type of oppressive othering. Baker Fletcher's description of Jesus as the embodiment of the perfected imago Dei as a crucial liberatory frames my description of the Missio Dei. Her focus on the personhood of Jesus and the liberatory nature of his ministry. She argues that if Jesus was just a spirit like us, then the rest of us humans are likewise called to holistic relationship with the planet. In this way, accepting that they were created in the image of God allows the spirit of liberation to work within, persuade, and to love African American Christians into carrying out the mission of God. In other words, the Imago Dei unfolds outward towards the Missio Dei. As it relates to a liberative theological ecology, the Missio Dei is best understood as humanity's vocation to exercise stewardship among non-human animals and caring for the earth by cultivating a holistic relationship with our planet. To be sure, exercising stewardship among Christians or among creation should not be understood as an attempt to create an egalitarian relationship between all created beings as equals. The biblical analysis that I use in my larger project shows how the Missio Dei to exercise stewardship could only be successfully accomplished if Christians live up to the responsibilities conferred upon us as bearers of the Imago Dei. This interpretation of the Imago Dei stresses the role of human action in dynamic relationship with God. In other words, what we as God's representatives are called to do on earth. In this way, the relationship between human beings and the rest of creation is not equal. Rather, human beings are placed in a position of power and responsibility and required to exercise their power in non-oppressive means. However, I agree with eco-feminist philosopher Karen Warren that there may be nothing inherently problematic about hierarchical thinking in conceptions and relations of power and privilege in contexts other than oppression. It's clear, in context other than oppression. Warren notes that hierarchical thinking is useful in the sciences, for instance, plant taxonomies and biological nomenclature, and that responsible parents may exercise legitimate power and privilege within the household. There is a hierarchy in the house, obviously, with parents and children. These hierarchical relationships are only oppressive if a logic of oppression is in place that attempts to justify unjust and exploitative treatment. In this way, the Missio Dei to exercise stewardship among non-human animals and caring for the earth places the responsibility of care and tending the garden on human beings themselves. In this sense, the Missio Dei becomes more than just a softer kind of dominion. Rather, human beings are responsible for tending the garden of creation because, among other reasons, they have played a primary role in creating the ecological problems that currently face our planet. For Christians, our commitment to anti-racism and elimination of the category of the other, which has been extended to the earth, compels us to seek, I would argue, both ecological justice and food justice. A reinterpretation of these three theological categories, the Imago Dei, the Imitatio Christi, and Missio Dei, are essential for the development of a liberative theological anthropology. As relates to food justice, a liberative theological anthropology enables us to see that a just food system is not only possible, but also divinely appointed. Ultimately, for Christians, the fight for food justice will require us to embrace a religious imagination that empowers us to envision a way of being in the world that has not yet been accomplished. Thank you.
So help me thank Christopher again for, no, I don't like being called Val. So.
I was told if my mom was here and somebody called me Chris, she would freak out. So that's not what she calls me. So.
Yeah, I don't like being called Val either, so there's that. Help me thank Christopher again for what has been a thick presentation, and I want to try to unpack some of that. So I call this a thick presentation because I think when you started out talking about what food justice looked like and then turned us toward theological anthropology, which is to say that we can't even get to food deserts because we can't think of what human means. Like we have to redefine that. I was like, huh. And and the reason that caught my attention so fully is because this may seem totally unrelated, but this is at the level of feelings. It's because this weekend, when 2 black men were arrested in a Starbucks in Philadelphia for doing what people do in Starbucks, which is sitting around waiting on somebody, I I remember thinking when I first saw the pictures of the look of resignation on these two black men's face, because to resist would have been more dangerous, that they were being treated like animals. Like that was the thought that ran through my mind. So I want to talk about, I want you to say something, so that's the first thing I thought about. The second thing I thought about was an Alice Walker quote where she says, if I cut the tree, if I chop down the tree, I bleed. And so the whole notion of care of creation as seeing ourselves integral to all of creation and not just literally lording, I really mean that word, lording over creation. Third sort of thought was Zora Neale Hurston's Black Women on the Mule of the World. So when you start talking about the intersectionality of race, gender, class, where's the bottom for that? I hate the oppression Olympics, but you get what the notion I'm trying to get at. That we can't even think about food justice because we have all this inherited and embedded anthropological theology that resists equity.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know.
I'm gonna start with the first one and then move on. But no, I mean, I think each of those are deep, and those are essentially what I was trying to gesture towards. I think the situation.
So I got you.
So you got it.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
The situation happened in Starbucks, and I think the reaction is consistent with what most people who are compassionate, how they would respond. They see this happen, they would think, man, they are being treated like animals, just like they're not being treated like humans, And I think, and so that's why I want to say, like Baldwin, like I think we know this connection has been made, like we're deeply aware, and it is literally because we refuse, and by we, I'm talking, and I have to say, and I use it in my presentation, I say we a lot, I refer to myself as like, I want to include myself in this. And so even in this notion of talking about American Christian culture, I can't necessarily divorce myself from it, right? Like, we as a society have extended this animal othering to people of color, And so, as I said, when one isn't acting white or performing whiteness in ways that is acceptable to those in power, then you are automatically seen as a threat. And so what happened was in this bigger situation, they were just asked to leave, and they said, no, we're waiting for somebody. They want to use the bathroom, and they didn't buy anything. Again, people do this stuff all the time. And so because that right there happened, they were perceived as a threat, and so they are therefore cast in that particular that hierarchy. And so that's what limits American culture to have a kind of compassionate empathy towards those who are marginalized, right? And so if you can't even allow people just to sit down, right, just to talk,
in a place that people do that.
If people sit down and talk, right, how are you going to be convinced to take seriously the marginalization and oppression as basis of food justice of this group of people? And the sad part is, actually let me go back to this map. When I talk about that food desert map, what I really want to point out, right?
Go back.
Right, yeah. So in these places right here, it's not like these places are all black people, right? There's white people down here. And this is a particular voting line, as we see, right? Especially in West Virginia. So you see policies that are getting passed for the preservation of whiteness that hurt them. So my family lives in Louisiana. For the research for my larger project, I spent a bunch of time in Louisiana visiting old plantations and doing things like that. And you can see that the kind of food insecurity I was evaluating, I was studying black communities, but white people were right there suffering, And so it's this recognizing that even that upholding these kinds of ideologies hurt themselves and black people, I think is essential and critical for us to be able to move towards taking food justice seriously, especially from a theological perspective. Because if you don't see them as human, if you're the kind of church who has that all lives matter thing that has the Bible quotes on it, then that it's going to be almost impossible for you to extend compassion because you see racism as a, what's the word that people say, as a sin problem,
right.
as opposed to, whatever.
As opposed to systemic.
Yeah. And so that, to me, is the deeper issue that prevents us from really going all the way.
So I want to come back to food insecurity, food deserts, and then I'm going to open it up after these two things. One is I want to talk about languaging, which one of the things I heard you saying is that American Christianity, because that's what you were talking about. I almost want to say Christianities, but I understood you to be saying there's a racialized project that makes it a thing, not several things, right? And that all kinds of churches are infected, and I mean what I'm saying, by this racialized American Christianity, or Americanity, as Cameron Carter calls it, right? I guess I want you to say a little bit more about how we might construct a different kind. I don't know that language is the only problem, but it's one of the problems. So what is the kind of languaging retraining needs to happen in American Christianity to get at this problem that you're trying to address?
Yeah, I think I think that I don't know that we can actually construct a new language. I want to add, when people make blanket statements, I think it's important for us to actually ask them what they mean. Okay. So I think people say things like, oh, all lives matter, or I want this for all humans. Well, what do you really mean? Like, explain what you mean by human. Like, really have people actually get down to the details. Because what we have to do is help them, and I do need help. And so I try to do this in such a way that, so I am a pastor. So there's a part of me that tries to be deeply compassionate. Like, I try to be a good pastor, And so like that's what I want to be. And so I don't want to just be like, no, you're doing this wrong. I want to allow people to I want to pull it out of them, right? And so I want to help them unearth their own epistemological biases, right? What assumptions are you making about your source of knowledge that's allowing you to overlook all these other people? And I want to hold out hope that they're not doing it necessarily on purpose. There's a blend of some people who clearly are. I'm not a huge fan of, even going back to Starbucks, they're like, oh, it's unconscious bias.
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm like,
I'm not buying
I'm like, it seemed pretty conscious by the time the police got there, you know what I'm saying? And all the white people are like, hey, what did they do? I'm like, at that point, it's been made conscious, and they're still doing it, right? So it's more than unconscious bias. But, but that is a part of it. There's, that is a part of it. And so I think asking people to clarify what they mean when they say these terms, to get them to unpack for themselves how they define them, I think is critical. And so I did that for me with human. I really had to sit down and say, what do I mean when I wanted to say, when a white person, call me an animal? Well, no, I'm a human. Well, what do we mean by that? What do I mean once you be treating me like a human? And that helped me begin to wrestle with and say, okay, let me redefine these terms. And when I say I'm talking about humanity, I'm talking about it like this. Kind of an inclusive project. Because I think you're right, language allows us to, obfuscate, it's kind of like, so it's like, oh, we're all talking about the same thing, but we're really not talking about the same things, you may be using some of the same words, right? And so I think, so you're right, and the way I go about doing it is just ask more questions.
Right. It strikes me that it shows up in, policies around TANF and SNAP, where people where some politicians we have allowed certain politicians to convince us that the only people that are using these benefits or this safety net are people, undeserving people, read, of color, whatever, read that however you want to. So stripping away and pulling back that curtain so that we can actually see what we're looking at. I think about this now that we have an opioid medical problem as opposed to a cocaine drug problem. I mean, it's a challenge.
I want to say that really quick. I think that's useful in the sense that we have to, in regards to the language that you're talking about right now, I I think this is where structural analysis of racism is helpful, right? Where we can talk about, like I said, a racist racial project by looking at, because what happens is we end up in a world of what Ta-Nehisi calls, he said, what do you say, the nice racist white people, or the idea of racism without racists. Because no one's going to say, well, I can't say that now. Now the people are clearly racist. But for the most part, people aren't going to say they're racist, right? So we have to look at the consequences of policies to say, okay, can we say this is racist by who it actually harms, or sexist by who it actually harms? However, we can't just do that, because even if you do that, that alone, there's a case right now, an article I read about what's happening in Florida in the court system, where they try to put all these markers in there to try and prevent unfair sentencing, and judges were still sentencing black people for the same crimes as a white person, like for more. There has to be some tending to the ideological as well. Like it's really both. Like, and I look at ideology as structure, right? How are we structurally teaching these ideologies? So it's still structural racism, but it's trying to address it both at the same time. So I think I think you're heading in the right direction in terms of how we have to be able to honestly have a conversation about racism, and recognizing that yes, racist things happen, and that doesn't mean that you did something racist. That doesn't mean that you're an evil person. And that's the totality of your feelings, right? But I think we often get wrapped up in that. No one wants to be called a racist. Like, ugh.
But you also can't let somebody off the hook when something racist happens, and then it doesn't get addressed.
Yep.
So I mean this is the big challenge, right?
Yep.
Last thing, and then open to everyone else. I was visiting my sister when she lived in Atlanta. She was in West Atlanta, West End, and there was one Kroger and a mile from her in one direction, another Kroger a mile from her in the other direction. So she was between these two Krogers. One, I walked in one day and all the fruit was clearly less than safer. Like the bananas were browning, the whole 9 yards, all of that. And so then I went to the 2 miles down the road to the other Kroger. I changed zip codes by 2 miles, and the aisles were wider, the fruit was fresh, the whole 9 yards. In front of one Kroger was a Popeyes, a McDonald's, and I forget what else, kind of fast food. In front of the other was a Panera. I can't remember what the other sort of thing was. I think there might have been Starbucks. Yes. There was very different, like 2 miles apart from each other. So when you talk about this health disparity because of this, like, it's not even, it is food desert. Like there are people who have to go 5 miles to get food. Yep. And if you don't have a car, that's for a whole lot of reasons problematic. Okay, so there's that, but it's also the quality of the food that's being brought to particular stores. You want to say? I
do actually, and I'm glad you asked me, because some of this, I wanted to address this, but I knew I was already going to talk too long, and so I wanted to, in regards to the role of supermarkets, in that the book that I co-edited, The Future Beat Without Animals, that we talked about, the article I have in there talks about how these grocery store chains where they get their marketing information from. And so much of the marketing information they get, they hire companies that go out and they pool census and survey data. What I've actually was able to find is data that shows that they're getting false data, either making up data, or not getting the data they're claiming to get at all. And so they're labeling certain communities, inner city communities, they're giving them off, like there was one where they said that people in this community like go to laundromats and like chicken and waffle houses. I mean, like totally racialized language, right? But when you actually look at the data that was collected by the city and state, you actually saw these neighborhoods actually did have the economic capacity to support these stores. So some of it is where they're getting their information from. So they're getting bad information and they're using that to make these decisions. And that information is also used to where they ship this food, right? So they're looking at sending the food that they think they can actually get the most bang for their buck at these nicer stores. On the other side, the other thing that happens that perpetuates these deserts is these grocery stores will create policies where if they they sell a store, like if a store closes, they create a policy that no other, I'm trying to think of the name of it, it's escaping me right now, but there's a rule in place that California is trying to overthrow right now, because after these grocery stores leave and they sign something, a deed restriction, so that no other grocery store can actually be on that property for like the next 10 years. So they intentionally created food deserts to push you to the new store, right? So they do these things on purpose, essentially for profit and for money, and it's completely legal. It's completely legal. And so food deserts are there's capitalism involved.
Sure.
Like the state has to get involved to prevent some of this stuff and allow public transportation to be there. And we have to find ways to hold grocery stores accountable, legislative ways, right? Which probably is going to result in, like, where I'm from, in San Diego, there are 4 co-op grocery stores in urban areas that are working, that make money, that work well, right? You have to pay a fee, but it's like a fee people actually can afford to pay, in addition to the money they make, in addition to the state revenue, right? So San Diego is trying to be a little more progressive. And that being said, San Diego doesn't have a huge percentage of population people of color, you know, and so they don't have to do as much work. I guess what I'm trying to say. So, but yeah, that is a huge issue as it relates to health disparities, especially for black women. Like that's why I looked it up, because black women deal with what medical experts call weathering, where they deal with so much by being black women. Even when they go to the doctors don't believe what black women are saying.
Yes.
And so, I mean,
it's a whole nother
I know, it's a whole
story.
other, but I'm saying, like, all this stuff to me is interconnected.
Right, it is. It is. Yes. We're opening.
I'm Don Newman, the Center for Ethics and Values organization sponsoring this. I'm also the microphone runner. I have one comment, and that is, in light of the time, please keep your questions brief and don't ask follow-ups. But one more thing is that it's best if you talk in the microphone like this.
Just following the SNAP commentary, I wanted to
Use the mic.
I wanted to get your take on this idea that the current administration has to use food boxes versus SNAP benefits. I'd love to hear, you know, because I can see how ridiculous it is, but it can also be like an accessibility. You wouldn't need the supermarket, you know, because it would be delivered. So I would love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, they are basically trying to create food boxes such that this is where the idea of a market-based solution, right? So they're trying to hire these companies to bring people food. But there's a lot of regulation that gets lost in the quality of food that gets delivered, right? So there's a lot of unknowns. And I think that alone, not only accessibility in terms of people actually being able to deliver the food, but being able to figure out what kind of food you're going to get, the quality of food. Are you working with local providers, or is it going to be the kind of likely that it's going to be supermarkets? You know, a huge part of our agricultural problems is the fact that it's dominated by 5 large companies. And that's what's marginalizing a lot of the local farm movement. It's because you have ConAgra and like a few others that dominate it. And so my concern will be, similarly, what we see happening in prisons, right, is the sense that when you have, and I say prisons because I want to be clear about how this administration works, and in terms of who they think they're feeding. And I also want to be clear that the data that I use right now, it took me weeks to find these graphs. When everything that's listed on federal websites that relates to food security changed a week after he got elected. And so, like, I had to hunt, peck, and find these graphs because it is not easily accessible. It's there. So I want to be fair. It's there because obviously I had it, but it's just where's the priority to where it's placed, you know? And so yes, I have some concerns about that. That's why I don't think it is sustainable. I think it's a market-based solution rather than actually looking towards the community, a more like I said, a co-op community grocery store model. I think would be much more effective. Thank you for your question.
Is it true that July 23rd to July 27th you'll be doing a one-week intensive at NTSO on unpacking these questions for an entire week of teaching, where auditors and others might be able to take that? Is this a true thing?
Well, auditors and people from the community can spend a whole week with you?
Yes.
July 23rd through 27th in Delaware, Ohio?
That is true. That is true. But yeah, so I'll be unpacking more what I talked about today. I briefly touched on food. I spent a lot more time on theology. But those two things to me are deeply connected. So I want to be spending a week here in the summer. I'm really excited to get a chance to have the opportunity to do that. So thank you for that great question.
And signing up is easy. You know, he doesn't have his hand up, but I would like Heber Brown III, who is going to speak tomorrow at MTSO, to talk about addressing food deserts, because that's a part of why he's here, to piggyback.
Hey, can I ask a question too?
Sure.
My question is.
Can you tell us about addressing food deserts first? He did that.
Oh, we do that
That's your
first?
question.
Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am, yes, ma'am.
I call on him because he says yes, ma'am, to me.
And yeah, so very quickly, basically, I work with black churches in primarily Baltimore, but now springing into Virginia and North Carolina as well. And working with black churches to use land that they own to grow food on their land, and then link and network these churches together to create really an alternative food system, particularly in partnership with black farmers in eastern North Carolina who, as I visit with them, I see their fresh food going to spoil in the field because the local markets lock them out of opportunities. And so in about a 5-hour stretch of Highway 95, we're linking together this partnership between black churches and black farmers and creating our own system where churches become distribution centers and places where people can not only get food, but also farmers can get opportunities with.
Okay.
And I'll say more about that later.
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow, that's right.
And
Tomorrow.
MTSO.
Yes, MTSO tomorrow. But my question, I'm curious about, and you kind of touched it briefly, so forgive me, it was early in your piece. I'm curious about health disparities as you spoke about them. And when I've seen health disparity comparisons between black people and white people around the question of nutrition, food justice, et cetera, it's like white people are the standard for health. Like whiteness is still centered when we do these comparisons around nutrition and the like. And given your comments that came later in terms of decentering whiteness and understanding what human means, I'm curious as to if you've seen any examples or if your imagination can help us to see what might be some other ways that we gauge health in our community that does not center whiteness even as comparisons.
Thank you so much for asking that question. I had not, and I mean, so you and I actually had a conversation on the way up here where I talked about how central this is to my project, Decentering Whiteness, and I had not even thought about that in regards to these the data. In part because that's how the data is organized, right? It's basically just trying to talk about disparities and saying, well, this is the best, and where do other people fall? And the scary part is, even, so the data that I've done some work with in China or work with Chinese, they use American data as well to compare their health standards to white Americans. Yeah, and so it's exported, that's what I want to say.
So the racialized project is complete.
Yeah, it's being exported. I think what we could do is to actually develop goals that we believe are attainable and for our own communities relates to these issues like diabetes, cancer prevention, all these other kinds of things, and maintain saying these are the goals we strive for outside of understanding what they would be defined by normative white culture, but taking seriously the kinds of structural inequalities that are in place that we know we need to overcome, right? I think even naming things like this and just saying that we want to have this kind of, we know we want our infant mortality rate, for instance, to be this low, and not mentioning whites and just saying that this is what we think is helpful. To me, that's how you begin to do it. And in some ways, I would argue this data that we can pull from, we probably would be better served to actually pull data from either. I don't want to speak clearly on what different countries in the African continent, because I'm not 100% sure on the data. But I do know Spain, France, England, Germany. Yes, all those countries they make American health disparities to shame, even for white Americans. And so perhaps using some of those as baselines, saying, well, this is what we think we deserve. Because they label their foods, right? It's like, they do things like that, like labeling, crazy, crazy, low food, do these things that are like, things like that we actually can have some other goals. But the challenge is that American healthcare knowledge, not healthcare, but American healthcare knowledge, our doctors are pretty much a standard bearer. So people are importing that around the world. But I'm going to try to do that now that you asked, because that has my whole mind going another way. So thank you, that's a great question. I really appreciate that.
Well, if there are no questions, I'll ask you to join me in thanking I'm trying to use it now.